that is really aimed for consumers. We call it buyer power, helping people either to avoid getting into a bad contract, like a car loan, or your tips, your strategies for helping people to avoid online fraud. Then how should they deal with it? What's their best remedy?
Hello.
How's it going?
Going good, yeah. How are you?
Good. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, no problem.
My name's Chuck. Help me with your name.
My name is Zuodi.
Lodi?
Yeah.
All right. And how do I pronounce your last name?
It's Liao. Liao.
Liao. Okay.
Yeah.
Basically, we have a podcast that is really aimed for consumers. We call it buyer power.
Okay.
And so I'm a lawyer. We do a lot of consumer law, which is helping people either to avoid getting into a bad contract, like
Mhm.
a car loan or a home loan. So we do a lot of car cases. We do a fair amount of what's called FCRA, which is
Mhm.
helping people to avoid fraud like identity theft, basically mistakes on their credit report, keeping a
Okay.
clean, fraud-free credit report. And
Hmm.
that's really a hot topic. So what we're really trying to figure out, and I think, want to talk to you about is what you've seen when it comes to fraud. I know you were at BMO and I know you've been with other big companies. And so we're really trying to get a sense of not just what it looks like on the inside of these big companies, but also if you could speak to, and we'll get into more specific questions, but I think the gist for today, how can a consumer, A, avoid getting hacked or having their ID, stolen?
Hmm.
And I've got very personal stories where we've had clients who have had their retirement savings stolen out of
Hmm.
their account, completely wiped out overnight, and people who didn't even know about it until like months later, they get an IRS notice saying, by the
Hmm.
way, you owe fees for early withdrawal from your retirement account. They're
Right.
like, what are you talking about? I didn't withdraw from my retirement account. So it's pretty crazy that it's happening more and more. And we recently had our own. We had someone who hacked into our emails, and so we know from firsthand experience that it's the level of fraud is really sophisticated, and
Hmm.
the stakes are pretty high. They're stealing thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and we've heard stories about Bitcoin theft as well, where they're taking millions of dollars. Just a couple background questions. Have you been on other podcasts? Have you talked about fraud and fraud investigation, anything like that?
No, I've not been on any other podcasts. I've spoken sometimes to members of my team that are, I guess, less senior than me, like through presentations and through trainings.
Mm-hmm.
But I haven't been on any podcast so far, no.
Okay, yeah. I just didn't know if you've done other interviews or if you've collaborated with others. I know that you've got a LinkedIn profile,
Hmm.
but one of the goals of this process is to really shine a light on your experience. And from that, a lot of times we have people who want to connect with you and talk a little bit more about that. So if it's something that you're open to, we can certainly put that out there.
Definitely open to that. Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. Great. And of course, to that end, and we can talk about it later as well, but if there's anything we can do to help you um, moving forward in terms of promoting connections or anything like that, we're happy to
Hmm.
do that. Like
Okay.
sharing links. We'll have a link to this if you want to share a link as well on your profile or any of your
Okay.
sites. So you want to just talk to me a little bit about your background, having grown up in the Bay Area, graduating from UC Davis, and a little bit about working at Bank of the West and BMO and what you were doing in your
Okay.
roles.
Sounds good. After I graduated in 2013, I worked in a few like community customer service roles. I worked at a labor union and then I worked at Kaiser Permanente and then I worked at a nonprofit. I gave it a few years of doing that. And then after that, I started wanting to go into tech. My first job in tech was at Google in 2015 as a content moderator. And that essentially is like the content that goes in through Google ads. And then looking for, in this case, malware. So I worked with the kind of technical team that looks for malware in like Google, like AdWords and DoubleClick ads. After that, I worked in trust and safety on a safety team and on a spam team at Facebook. And that was most of the extent of my tech experience. When I got into fraud investigations was really at Twilio. Twilio is a service that's used for a lot of like mass messaging. So a lot of companies use Twilio as like an IVR or as another service that relays text messages that are sent to a business and then uses them so that either an automated or agent-driven message is sent back to the customer. So I worked there for about a year working in fraud investigations. There was a lot of forms of fraud at that company. So we dealt a lot with toll fraud. Toll fraud is essentially when someone hijacks the system and then they pump a bunch of calls to a specific country, usually to like Zimbabwe or like a really obscure country. And the purpose of that is that some of these numbers gain or like toll-free calls. So they gain money when you call them basically. And so they're pumping like things into the system. And Twilio uses a lot of automated systems. They use a software called SIFT, which does thresholds. So if it meets the threshold for fraud, then it detects it and it disables it. And on our team, we had to look at the disablings and figure out, is this actually legitimate? I did a bit of customer service work with the customers as well. A lot of enterprise customers write into Twilio because their services get disabled for fraud related reasons. And for the most part, their usage is legitimate and it's usually a false positive, but we have to look at it and figure out where they went wrong and communicate that to them in a mostly transparent way so that they can understand how to avoid that going forward. After that, I was hired at Bank of the West in mid 2020, towards the middle of the pandemic. And I was still looking for a job. And well, I relaxed for a few years in the pandemic, but then I was still looking for a job. They hired me as a contractor for about 6 months, and then they promoted me to full time in December 2020. And I worked there for about 3 years after that. During my time at Bank of the West, I went through the BMO transition. But in the beginning, I mostly learned Bank of the West policies, and I was an investigator on the corporate security team, learning a lot about different kinds of fraud that occurs, but also about working at a bank. I didn't even know really distinctions between different kinds of checks and why they would return and things like that. So I had to learn a lot of that kind of from the ground up. But it was a good experience overall.
Tell me about corporate security. What does that mean in a more like day-to-day context?
Corporate security, the way that fraud teams are organized across companies is not always the same. At Bank of the West, corporate security refers to the kind of security work that involves fraud and the kind of security work that happens at the corporate level. So I worked in the corporate office, I didn't work in a branch, and then the corporate office kind of works with the branch and collaborates to deal with customers that might be accused of fraud or customers that are suffering from third-party fraud, which is like an outside entity kind of affecting them and committing fraud against them. And so the distinction is at the corporate level as far as us not working in a branch and us working separately, and that kind of thing.
So I think this is, really interesting and it ties into what we've been seeing lately.
Mhm.
There are a lot of stories about people who have accounts and I've personally had my bank accounts suddenly see charges on your debit card, right?
Mhm.
And you know that you haven't been to Oklahoma. You're working in LA and suddenly you see
Mhm.
all these charges for a gas station in Oklahoma and like Best Buy and things like that.
Mhm.
So it's pretty clear that someone got a hold of your bank info. That's something that I guess I would call third party fraud, right?
Mhm. Yes.
So once it's determined that there's a third party, I know from my own experience, the bank usually does an investigation. I imagine it goes to a team like
Mhm.
yours if you're the bank, and
Yeah.
then you verify that, yeah, somebody got a hold of the debit card, ran up some
Mhm.
charges, that card gets frozen, canceled, they reissue a new card, and there's
Mhm.
usually a refund back for
Yeah.
all of those funds.
Yes.
I can tell you that based on what happened to me. So I don't know
Uh,
if there's more to it than that. But I do have some questions about what happens when you're not so sure if it's the customer who's defrauding the bank. How does that work? How is that different? Like how do you ultimately make the determination whether the customer sold the card number
mhm.
or was negligent? Maybe they lost their card and forgot to report it stolen or something like that. Are
Mhm.
there cases where the customer does get basically assessed for these charges? And when does that happen?
Okay. Usually, when we start an investigation, we look at whether it's a corporate account or an individual account. In the case of corporate accounts, it almost always, it pretty much always is a case of third-party fraud because the corporation, the company wouldn't go ahead and commit fraud on behalf of themselves. And so we approach those from a third-party perspective. With customers, no matter how wealthy the customer is, we assume it could be first-party fraud, and we look at the customer's individual usage. Sometimes it's more ambiguous than looking at a geographic location because sometimes customers will get into like Bitcoin and other things that aren't confined to a geographic area. It's not as simple as like looking at a gas station in another state, but sometimes they'll get into like new forms of activity, and we might see that they've never used Bitcoin before, but they really could be just getting into it at that point in time. And those are really important cases where we try to reach the customer. Sometimes customers have changed their number, and sometimes they're hard to reach for various reasons. So we don't just go by that, but we try to make the best investigation that we can. As far as reporting like a lost card, generally we are able to talk to the credit agency and make sure that's not reported as first party fraud, but rather third party fraud. But as far as the way that one of the other departments reimburses cases, it really depends on what actions the customer took and how negligent maybe the customer was as far as losing their information before they can be refunded. I think that's like a different process than the work that we do.
So let's talk a little bit about the third party fraud.
Mhm. Yeah.
And we recently had a case where this is something that we're hearing about a lot more. I have a colleague who runs a real estate
Hmm.
company and they specialize in loans and large real estate developments, getting loans funded for these
Hmm.
big projects and purchases and refis and things like that. In a case where what we're hearing about are these last, literally like last second emails where everything is set and wiring instructions are sent back and forth. And
Hmm.
at the last second, an email is sent saying, change of plans. We're going to give you new wiring instructions.
Hmm.
And that email is typically altered. There's a letter that's spelled differently. Everything else is exactly the same. The URL, the domain, everything looks exactly the same. But maybe
Hmm.
instead of Mary, it's instead of Mary, it's Many. Something that
Hmm.
you wouldn't even notice unless you looked really carefully. And then it comes across as saying, oh, new wiring instructions. Here's the new account number, wire it to this. And then it happens. $500,000 gets wired to a fake account and no one realizes that it's a fake account until it can be much later. How is that handled? How can that be avoided?
Okay, so as far as how that's handled, usually if that happens, we are able to reimburse the customer, but what we first do is look at which bank the funds actually went to. We try to look at these cases as quickly as possible, and then we reach out. If it goes from Bank of the West to Chase Bank, we'll reach out to investigators at Chase Bank to have them freeze the funds and then return them to the extent possible. As far as how to avoid that, I think you would want to look at one, the email address that it was sent from, as far as whether it's from a corporate domain or whether it's from a Gmail or something like that. Obviously, with a Gmail, you can change the name of the account very easily. With the corporate domain, you would have to have access to corporate resources in order to make your own email account on that domain. And we very rarely ever see that, right? Because people don't really gain that level of access. So if you see like a personal Gmail, even if the other customer does have a personal Gmail, they really shouldn't be sending it from a personal email address because that could be prone to fraud. Usually, we would suggest that they make a call before the funds are transferred just to verify that, hey, you did send this email and that this is a legitimate email. You really do want to change the wiring instructions. The problem now with AI is that some of the calls can be made using deep fake audio. So you want to be very specific with details in the call so that they can't fake a very generic call to you saying, hey, we have the funds. Okay, just send it. So that's one of the new things, the new threats that are really going on now. But the main thing is just figure out if it's a corporate domain and figure out how to verify through phone call a few details about the transfer so that you're not caught in a place where fraud happens.
Can we drill down on that a little bit? Because I think it's
Yeah, sure.
really interesting. And we're hearing about literally like millions of dollars being wired to bank accounts.
Yeah.
And so you said a couple things that were really interesting. Number one, you said that if they're able to gain access to a corporate domain, then it's a higher level. Does that
Yeah.
mean they've hacked? If it comes from Zuodi at Google dot
Hmm.
com, right?
Yeah.
Does that mean they've hacked into Google and they're able to
See,
access the
yeah, so
emails?
what happens is like a domain like Google would pretty much never be hacked. Like I've never seen that happen with a major domain. With a small business, sometimes they can gain access to the small business password and create an email address on that domain or hijack an existing email address on that domain. But that's still pretty rare, right? That requires an extra level of work, extra level of access, and that generally implies that like someone who does this has some degree of connection to someone in the company and some degree of access. Maybe someone in the company wrote down the password carelessly. Usually, the IT person writes down the password carelessly, and then someone gains access that way. But that's still pretty rare. I think usually having a corporate email address and seeing that it comes from the same domain as the actual company is a good indicator of it not being fraud.
So let's say, because I have firsthand knowledge of a case where an email came from a corporate domain
Hmm.
and it's the same thing. Instead of going to Mary, Mary, it went to Mary, Many, at the corporate domain.
Okay.
And is it, once the investigation starts, is it possible to detect whether that domain was hacked for sure? Or are they, the people that commit the fraud, are they able to use fake domains and reroute emails from fake domains to another domain?
Okay, so one of the possibilities there is that maybe something in the domain was changed. For example, Google, maybe someone put it in capital and then they put like a zero instead of an O. Sometimes we see that, but that's usually pretty easy to catch. Sometimes we also see cases where it's first party fraud instead of third party fraud, where maybe someone in the company like worked with someone. That's still pretty rare. And usually we try to determine that by calling everyone in the company that we can reach. Or not everyone, the major players in the company that we can reach and asking them about what happened and seeing if there are any inconsistencies in the stories that are presented to us. So we can figure out if there maybe is first party fraud. Sometimes, or a lot of times, we can't make a final determination on that, but we can always report the ambiguity to the department that is responsible for refunds. And we can always look into, or we can always kind of make the case to the company that maybe this happened and give them our side of the story of what we discovered.
Okay. So let me ask you this. Let's go further down the path of this scenario where, again, my friend Josh, he owns a real estate company.
Mhm.
And let's say that at the very last second, when all of the emails were going back and forth, and there's always pressure to close these loans. It's always a high pressure. We got to close by Tuesday. We got to close. And at the
Yeah.
last second, an email comes from what looks to be, for all intents and purposes and subject to every level of scrutiny, it looks to be corporate domain with no alterations.
Hmm.
And if Josh wires $500,000 to that fake account, his bank is, we'll say, Citibank. It
Hmm.
goes to another bank that turns out to be offshore, but it has like a US, a name, an address,
Yeah.
Bay City funding in Delaware.
Yeah.
How does Josh go about reporting, reversing, collecting? Whose fault is it, and where does the money come from? If he calls Citi, his bank, and says, "Hey, I need to report this fraud," let's say he doesn't realize this until a week later. That
Yeah.
money's gone. That account is closed. That email account is closed. What should he do then?
Usually, in the case that does happen, it's pretty rare, but he would reach out to the to both the bank that sent the funds and the bank that received the funds. Usually, the action that's taken would happen with the bank that received the funds, as far as investigating where the funds went and closing the account that the funds went into, but also investigating the trail of how was that account open, who maybe opened that account, and does that account have any connection to the senders, right? The senders being the people who work at the company, the people who are responsible for sending those funds. I would just really strongly call back to the fact that for each of these major transactions, each of the major emails in that chain, you want to call the other party and just verify you sent this email. Like it's very
Okay.
easy when there's $500,000 at stake, you can't not make a phone call, right? In that case, and
Right.
people are very easy to reach when there are these big value transactions that are happening. So
Right.
I would suggest that for each one, you make a phone call. Like I bought
Right.
a house like 3 years ago, and for every single thing with the escrow company, I would make a phone call because I worked in, fraud prevention, and I realized that like people could actually hijack that kind of conversation and those kinds of email threads. So definitely, if when at a corporate level, they want to be able to do that, even if it sounds redundant.
Can you talk to me about a good way to verify in a phone call? What questions should you ask to make sure it's not just the scammer directing the phone call to their own agent?
I would say that you could use a verification code in the email and then have them call you. Just say, call me and present the code. And then you present the code. That's the strictest way of doing that, right? Present the code and then they're like, okay, yeah, I did send that code. Usually, though, the scammers are not exactly aligned with the other party. So the scammers might know the same day that you're going to make this transaction. Usually they know that, but they don't know exactly what time that email was sent. So if the other party is saying, I sent this at 3:11 p.m., and you can verify, that's usually a pretty good indicator that's a legitimate email, if that makes sense.
Okay, so you're saying a good thing to do is to
Like a timestamp, essentially.
call, either put a code in there somehow
Hmm.
in the email or some kind of a timestamp. But I think that's really helpful and useful. And let's say that they do call and that they do ask a couple questions to verify and they feel that it's legitimate. They send the funds and then they find out after the fact that they got scammed. And I'm telling you this because this is what happens. And these are the calls that we get. We got scammed. We had no idea. We sent money to a legit, looked like a corporate domain. Possible they got hacked. We want to prove that they got hacked because we want them to have to come out of pocket that $500,000. What would you do to prove that it was the other person's fault? That it, instead of coming from the escrow company, that company got hacked and it came from a fraudulent email that looked like it was from the escrow company. How could you prove that it was the fault of the escrow company? Is that even possible?
Sometimes it depends on one of the things it depends on is whether the email was a phishing email or whether it was hacking. Like a phishing email would just look pretty similar, but the domain would be different essentially. There's something in the domain that's different. It could be a
Sure,
domain that sounds like the same company, but it could be like not the domain that that company uses, if that makes sense. For
sure.
example, Infinity Finances versus Infinity.com, right? Infinity might be a company, Infinity Finances might be their actual site, and Infinity.com might actually just be like a secondary site set up by the compromiser to trick the individual. So in those kinds of
Yeah,
cases, it would be the party that loses the money that kind of falls for it, essentially, right? In
right.
cases where the actual domain is taken over, then you can say it's a third party hack and that the escrow company in that case made a mistake as far as letting that hack happen.
I know this is really taking it to the ultimate, the nth degree for this example, but if it's determined that it was the escrow company that was hacked,
Hmm.
is there an expert, or is this something where you or people like you consult to prove yes, the escrow company got hacked, yes, they're liable because they should have had fraud prevention, especially an escrow company. Someone who's responsible for handling millions of dollars should have some
Hmm.
fraud prevention in place so that someone like my friend Josh doesn't end up getting scammed for half a
Hmm.
million dollars when his client puts the funds into his account and sends it over.
Hmm.
So, how does someone go about hiring a fraud prevention or a fraud specialist, an expert who
Hmm.
can prove when fraud occurs to help people get their money back and to help them to avoid having to pay for these really expensive mistakes?
Okay. Most of the fraud experts and fraud specialists that work in my field do a mixture of reactive work and proactive work, but they do a lot of proactive work as far as making sure the controls are tight. In a case like the one that you described, I think that they would go to the recipient party and ask for the information security team or someone who works in there to see if there was an internal compromise at that company, because that's where it would really stem from, right? Like it would be them usually where something happened that there was a hack or there was someone internally at that company that might be responsible for it. So it would be an internal investigation on that part. And then fraud investigator like me will just try to keep in touch a few times a week to see if there's any progress in what's going on and communicate back to them anything that we see on our end as far as that transaction goes.
And I'll make this the last question because I know we're really deep and I really appreciate you
Hmm.
giving us some good info.
Yeah.
Are there investigators like yourself and consultants who do this, who are able to communicate with other internal security teams and really establish where was the breach and who was at fault?
We do communicate with other security teams, but the problem is that to really definitively establish that is usually hard because the perpetrators, for one, they don't want to leave a trail, so they're pretty good at not leaving a trail. And then two, a lot of times what happens is that someone accesses the external company from like an IP or from something where there's no name attached to it. And then even if you look at who owns the IP or something like that, it doesn't show you a name. It shows you some sort of shell company that doesn't exist. And then they have many layers of hiding it. So we're not able to get a definitive answer most of the time. The best we can do is make a strong case for why it's a third party incident and why the customer should get their money back essentially. And then we forward that to another department.
And is that something that you're able to do for consumers? So if we have someone calling us, we're a law firm, and if we have someone calling us saying, my account got hacked, I got a fraudulent email. Actually, we run a large company. There's now this $500,000 claim. Is that something that you could help someone to investigate and recover potentially, or at least make an argument that it's no fault of that consumer. It's really
Mhm.
the fault of an elaborate hacking scheme where they really could not have known the difference between one email and another. Is that, would you say?
That's a fair thing to advocate for. And I
Yeah,
think that usually we hear from the customer first, but then any advocate for the customer can also reach out for us when the customer provides that contact information. There are anti-fraud services like ID Watchdog or Norton LifeLock, where those companies have their own representatives that work on behalf of a customer. So if a customer has, for example, like Norton LifeLock, they have their own representatives email us and try to advocate for the customer. And when we see that, we see that there's an increased degree of seriousness because those people will follow up with us like multiple times a week to see what
I
we're
see.
doing. We're inclined to obviously answer them. And so
Okay,
like law firm or like representatives of the customer can do essentially the same thing and try to advocate that way.
got it. Okay. And I think the last thing to talk about, I'd like to really have your take on how to help people, your tips, your strategies for helping people to avoid online fraud, especially because there's so much of it now. And I know you talked a little bit about verifying with phone call, talking to a real person. One thing that we're starting to hear about now is cyber policies, insurance
Hmm.
to help people, especially for ransomware, which is another huge problem for companies.
Hmm.
What do you think is the best? Let's just assume it's going to happen. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. What do you recommend for people to do to not just to prevent things, but let's say it happens to them, then how should they deal with it? What's their best remedy?
On a corporate level, I think dealing with ransomware is more of an information security and like technical kind of issue where I have some understanding of it, but it is too technical for me to really speak to. I did want to bring up one thing, which is that a lot of fraud that happens to individuals happens through someone that's adjacent to them or someone that they've recently met or connected with. So when you have conversations with strangers, when you meet new people, you don't want to reveal too much about like where you bank at, obviously, or those sorts of like account details, like personal details. And a lot of this third party fraud actually happens from what we've seen from family relationships. For example, like someone's son or daughter that's estranged might want to gain control of an account. And sometimes they have access to an account already, so they can make transactions and transfers out on their behalf. And it's not really outright like, stealing or outright fraud in that sense, but it definitely is one of those things where they might have done it without the other person's authority. And sometimes they try to argue that the elder person is suffering from dementia or suffering from someone else, where that's not substantiated. And they try to get the elderly person off the account. And that really is a form of elder abuse that we usually report to the agencies that are appropriate
Hmm.
because a lot of elderly people, unfortunately, are taken advantage of in that sense. So that's one of the
Yeah.
tasks that we usually do. And that's one of the things I want to make people aware of if I
I
can.
think that there's seems like there's just so much more to talk about, but I don't want to like keep you on
Right.
for an hour. Perhaps we could continue with the part two. There's some questions that come up later. But yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time today. Is there anything that you wanted us to know about? If there's any information, contact information, or anything that we should know about you?
I think my email or LinkedIn would be the best ways to contact
Yeah.
me. If anyone wants to talk about these things further or has insight in, or wants insight into my background. I don't have that much else. I don't have anything really to promote or anything like that, but
Okay.
it was
Great.
good to talk to you and get this message across for sure.
All right, Zodi. Thank you for your time. And yeah, we'll be in touch.
Okay, sounds good. Thank
All
you.
right, bud. Take care. I'll see you
Take
then.
care.
All right.
Okay,
Bye
bye.
bye.